Good morning, and I was told that on the internet we have an international audience. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Well, today, and welcome to the ARB Research Seminars. We have these every so often. And today we have Dr. Sonia Ye and Christopher Yang of UC Davis. The title of today's presentation and also the title of a research project report is Modeling Optimal Transition Pathways to a Low Carbon Economy in California. And by the way, the report should be available in a few days or so, and we'll put it online. Dr. Ye is a Carnegie Mellon graduate and is a research scientist at the Institute of Transportation Studies, University of California at Davis. She's a faculty member of the graduate group in Transportation Technology and Policy at UC Davis and an adjunct professor at Department of Engineering and Public Policy at Carnegie Mellon. Welcome. Her primary research interest is to advance the understanding of future energy systems and their environmental and social impacts, and to seek solutions that improve the societal process of making decisions toward a low-carbon energy system. Her expertise is in energy market economics and modeling. Dr. Yang is a Princeton graduate and is a research scientist working with the Sustainable Transportation Energy Pathways program at ITS UC Davis, and a faculty member in the Transportation Technology and Policy graduate program also at UC Davis. His research focuses on analysis of alternative fuels in advanced vehicles and their role in reducing transportation greenhouse gas emissions, with an emphasis on hydrogen and electricity supply and infrastructure. The report is very interesting. The project was very interesting. I was privileged to be the contract manager for a while. And there's a lot to be presented. So they have, I think I'll skip my speech, my 30-minute speech, and hand it over to Dr. Sonia Ye to start the presentation.
Thank you. Thanks, Ferdinand, for the nice introduction, and thanks everybody being here. It's an honor to be invited to give the research seminar, and I'm going to introduce my modeling team, my colleague and my modeling team. The model is actually built based on the PhD thesis by David McCullen, who is in Jassa, Austria, and primary modelers include Dr. Christian, who is going to present later, and then our grad students, Kale Ramiel and Saleh Zakaridi, as well as our supporting faculty advisors, Dr. David Bunch and Joan Ogden. One of the reasons of building California Times model is to create an economic model that helps us understand what are the optimum pathways to achieve our California climate targets. And the model is basically what we call a bottom-up technology reach model. In other words, it tries to make assumptions about future demand and look at demand growth as a result of population growth and GDP growth, and make assumptions about technology availability, resource availability, and their cost, and trying to meet the future demands based on assumption of resource and technology availability in the most cost-effective way. In most of the cases, and you're here today, that we run it in a cost minimization, means that it tries to minimize the cost to meet the target. In some scenarios that you also hear today, that we actually run with assumptions that we allow the service demand or the projected demand to be flexible and respond to price changes. In those cases, we actually try to maximize the total social welfare, and we call those scenarios as elastic demand scenario. But for most people, all you need to know is that it's an economic optimization model. It tries to meet the future demand with assumptions about technology and resource availability and cost in the most cost-effective manner. And the model The decision variables in the models are primarily the investment decisions of technology and the operating decisions of how often, how much you want to run the tech or utilize the technology when you want to use it. And in the elastic demand scenario, there's additional decision variables, that's the demand levels. And we run the model to see how do we meet the 80% greenhouse gas emission reduction goal by 2050. California Times model is a very useful tool to answer many policy questions. In our current phase of the work that we're going to present today, we do a lot of scenario analysis for this phase of the work. So we're trying to ask the question about, for example, how does placing a limit or a cap on greenhouse gas emissions affect the evolution of the energy system over time, and what are the cost impacts? And if we have some kind of climate policy, for example, what is the incremental cost or potential savings of greenhouse gas emission mitigation? And how do the policies, assumptions about policies, instruments, availability, and cost of technology affect the cost and technology evolution, adoption of the technology in the system? In the future work that we won't spend a lot of time to talk about today, but we're interested in doing a lot of deep dive into analyzing more important policy questions that the states need to address in the next decades and years. And so, for example, we're interested in asking questions about how do policies interact with one another, what are the interactive effects of the policy, what are the potential integrated effects that include costs and benefits of policies, or potential trade-offs, or even possibly unintended consequences. In this current version of model, we assume that the cost of technology is independent of the policy choices. And in the future run, we're interested in what are the effects of many policies adopted in California tend to be technology forcing that could have an impact on technology costs. So better the ability, we intend to use the model to help us better understand what's the potential impact of policy affecting technology costs over time and the technology adoption rates. How can policy incentives and investment affect consumer choices, and vice versa? How do consumer choices affect the choice of policy incentives and investment decisions? We've run quite a few models, and we found out that demand reductions is a very important mitigation strategy in reducing the cost, and you'll see some of the results. But we need to do more work to understand what's the role of demand reduction play, and how does it interact with other policy and mitigation options. And lastly, but not least, one future question we'd like to answer is how does the presence or absence of GHG policy outside of California would affect the California's greenhouse gas emission reduction goal and its cost. I forgot to say, but if you have any quick clarification questions, please feel free to ask, and we'll try to address those clarification questions. So for this is a schematic diagram of our kind of the system boundary and the scope of our model. Basically, like I say, it's a whole system model. That means that we try to build up the model from identifying the primary energy resource, such as crude oil, natural gas, biomass feedstock, renewable energy. And those energy resources, we characterize their resource availability and cost, and they feed into conversion technologies such as refineries, power plants, and produce fuels or final energy such as electricity that used in end-use technology equipment in all the end-use sectors such as transportation, residential, commercial, industrial, and so on and so forth. Ultimately, the purpose of these technologies are to satisfy end-use service demand. So that include, for example, vehicle miles traveled, bus miles traveled, heated space, cool space, lighted space, and so on and so forth. So that's kind of our energy system. In this version of the model, we only count for energy-related greenhouse gas emissions. That can be expanded in the future, of course. And we also capture 3 different categories of emissions. First categories are emissions capped in the state. The second categories are the emissions that occur within the state, either fuel consumed within the state or demand as a result of demand within state. So that include interstate or international aviations and marine. Those emissions are not included under the cap, but we capture those in a separate category. And the third categories are upstream emissions, energy produced outside of a state as a result of demand for consumption within the state, and these are typically referred to as upstream emissions. So we try to capture 3 different emission categories, and one of the ideas is the ability to better analyze potential, for example, leakage effect and so on and so forth. We're going to present 2 BAU scenarios as well as 2 greenhouse gas emission cap scenarios and a bunch of sensitivity scenarios. So let me explain those. And for the BAU scenarios, it's basically we're assuming all the existing policies will be in place to 2020 or 2025 and keep at that level depending on specifics of the policy. And I will come back to the BAU low VMT scenario in a bit. And we also run different emission caps under the greenhouse gas emission target scenarios. Basically, there are different trajectory of meeting emission cap, and that I'll show you graphs later in the next slide. And in all of the greenhouse gas target scenarios, there's assumptions of low VMT that are anywhere between 10 to 20%, 24% below the BAU scenario. And we found that low VMT actually have a very big impact in terms of the cost estimates. And as a result, because we don't cost out the potential costs associated with VMT reduction or benefit associated with VMT reduction, we decided to incorporate low VMT in one of our BAU scenario. And the idea is that so people can compare apple with apples if they choose to. And in the end, when we show you the result, you can see that it really affects our cost estimate, the estimate of mitigation costs quite a bit, depending on which BAU scenario you compare to. So here we're not really making a value judgment. This is an ongoing effort that in the future we need to better understand what are the sources of VMT reduction, what are the impacts of VMT reduction, and how do you appropriately attribute the cost to either the BAU scenario or a greenhouse gas emission scenario, because that would affect your estimate of cost of mitigation quite a bit. It's a future research direction, but I want to point out here. So a couple slides on results quickly, then we'll go back to more detail about model assumptions. So here on the left-hand side, we show the BAU scenario, emission trajectories under the BAU scenario. BAU is basically the reference or business as usual scenario. To 2050, these different bars show the emissions from different sectors. On the top, transportation, the industrial, residential, commercial, transportation, industrial, residential, commercial, and the bottom is the agricultural. And the black lines is the total emissions. As you can see, under our BAU scenario, we actually project that emissions will flat out actually will be below the 2010, slightly below the 2010 emissions. Transportation sector is still the largest emission source under the BAU. And the right-hand side shows one of the greenhouse gas emission reduction scenario of achieve 75% reduction below the 1990 level. In that scenario, transportation is still the largest source of emission by 2050, and this is kind of our constraint look like. Basically, under our step scenario, we only have 2 constraints. We have a constraint on emission levels in 2020 and a constraint on emission levels in 2050. That's our step scenario. And you can see more clearly on this graph. On the left-hand side, we basically only set 2 constraints under the step scenario. 2020 and 2050 constraint needs to be 8% below the 1990 level. Then we also run a line scenario that basically set a constraint that emission reduction or the total emission level need to be linear between 2020 and 2050 goal. Yep. So those are kind of our two greenhouse gas emission cap scenarios. On the right-hand side, basically show the results in terms of total emissions under the BAU, under the greenhouse gas step scenario, and under the greenhouse gas line scenario. So those dashed line basically shows that the dashed line above those scenarios are when we include total emissions, including category 1 and 2. So that includes emissions occur inside of state, but not captured under our cap and trade program. I want to do a little bit diversion to kind of tell you a little bit about the California climate policy modeling comparison that we did, that we looked at 10 different models and compare the emission trajectories. We did a deep dive into 6 models that achieve the greenhouse gas emission target by 2050. The models that we compare include the ARB's vision model, Bayer model from UC Berkeley, our own California Times model, GHGenius model by the Lawrence Berkeley Lab, the Leap Switch model by UC Berkeley and Livermore Lab, and pathway scenarios by E3. These models are different in terms of their time, their system boundary, the time scale of modeling, and how they actually model, whether it's economic model or it's just a scenario model. But the total emission trajectories, there's a wide range of possible emission pathways to achieve the deep emission reduction goal. So on the left-hand side, you see the bound envelope of possible emission reduction pathways to achieve the 2050 target. And the right-hand side shows the cumulative total emissions. And this is what our California result compared to all the other models look like. We have the line scenario, basically a straight line between 2020 and 2050, and a step scenario where we just set a 2050 target and let the model decide how you want to achieve the 2050 goal. And you can see on the right-hand side, it translates to, in these both scenarios meet the 2050 target, but they translate to very different cumulative total emissions, which is something we don't talk about. They translate to very different climate impacts, for sure. And I want to point out that the reason to explain why under the step scenario, where we don't put any constraint, just let the model decide, the model like to do emission reduction later compared to a linear scenario. And that can primarily explain by 2 factors. One is the assumptions about discount rate. The higher discount rate you assume, the model like to do things later. Do mitigations later because the costs are discounted in the future. Therefore, it's cheaper to wait in the future to do more emission mitigation. Second reason is in this version of model, like I mentioned earlier, that cost of technologies are assumed exogenously. Therefore, the policy does not have any influence in reducing the cost of technology. So this is kind of a caveat of the model, and because the policy affecting early adoption does not reduce technology costs, and technology costs is independent policy, the model again like to wait later when the cost of technology just it becomes cheaper automatically on its own. So these 2 reasons can explain why the model tend to, in this particular scenario, tend to do mitigation action later. Here I'm going to switch to Christian to give you a little bit more deep dive into our model assumptions. And if you have any quick clarification questions, I'll be happy to take them.
You say the technology costs cheaper later because of the discount rate only, or because the technology cost is coming down over time?
Right. So, sorry, I didn't explain very clearly. in this version of the model, the cost of technology are assumed to be exogenous. So they come down over time automatically. But in reality, especially a lot of policies adopted in California, they tend to be technology forcing. They want technology to be adopted early so they can drive down the cost of technology earlier. And in this version of the model, we didn't reflect that kind of reality because it involved more complicated model technique. Yeah, so this caveat kind of the model is kind of doing it's doing economically rational thing based on our assumptions, which is not perfect.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm going to take over and do more of a dive into the specific sectors and try and give you a little bit better sense of what's happening at the technology level. Okay, so as opposed to kind of the big picture of greenhouse gas emissions. So I'm going to focus first on the transportation sector. As Sonia mentioned, the model is sort of driven by our assumptions about demand for energy services. So in this case, we have demand for light-duty vehicle miles traveled, medium-duty miles, heavy-duty miles, bus miles, rail, aviation miles, and so forth. Okay, so all of these are assumptions that we put into the model out to 2050. Looking specifically at the light-duty sector, you can meet that demand for transportation services from a bunch of different technologies, and this is just a subset of the total number of technologies that we have. Gasoline vehicles, hybrids, diesel, plug-in hybrids, battery electric vehicles, and fuel cell vehicles, as an example. Each of these vehicle types, technology types, is supplied by different types of fuels. So the various liquid fuels, gasoline, diesel, some ethanol or other biofuels, electricity in some of the plug-ins, as well as the battery electric vehicles, and hydrogen in the fuel cell vehicles. For these particular fuels, they have to be produced in our model as well. And supplied, so that we need a refueling station of various types within the model. And so we model, again, the investment in all of these different technologies and choices. And then finally, to produce these fuels, for example, at a liquid fuel refueling station, you might need to supply that fuel from a refinery or a biofuel plant. Hydrogen is like electricity you can produce from a lot of different sources, so electrolysis, biomass gasification, on-site reforming or centralized reforming. And then electricity, there's a wide range of, obviously, as you know, electricity generation sources that can be used. And so all of these things are integrated in this model to again, satisfy this demand for light-duty VMT, as an example. Okay. So looking at total transportation fuel use, in our GHG step scenario, we have an overall decrease in the amount of transportation fuel used from 2010 to 2050. And there's a dramatic shift in the types of transportation fuels that are used. So in 2010, about 95% of our transportation fuel comes from petroleum. In 2050, in this particular scenario, about 41% comes from petroleum. The remainder comes from biofuels, which is 37%, and then a smaller fraction from electricity, hydrogen, and natural gas. Okay, so you can see it in this table right here. Yeah. So we have a pretty dramatic reduction in the amount of liquid fuels that's used as well. This production of biofuel plus petroleum, we have a lot more use of hydrogen, electricity, and gas. And then in this particular scenario, we've assumed a supply of about 7.3 billion gallons of biofuel that are available to the state. So this is both in-state sources as well as out-of-state resources that are from the western U.S. Okay, so there are some sources of biofuels that could be used in the model, but because they have high greenhouse gas signatures, are not chosen because they don't help us achieve the goal of our 80% reduction target. Okay, so the model is actually balancing all of these issues, not just we need fuel, but we need a certain type of fuel of a certain carbon intensity and so forth. And this particular graph shows the demand for fuel that includes fuel that's supplied at our airports and our ports, which including that interstate and international aviation marine travel. So not included in the cap, but it is included in our energy system. Okay. Looking specifically at the light duty sector, we have, again, a dramatic shift basically to electrification, both battery electric vehicles, plug-in hybrids, and hydrogen vehicles in 2050. The way you can read this graph here at the bottom, this blue block is our ICE vehicles, internal combustion engine vehicles. And so the x-axis tells you the total number of miles that's supplied by this type of vehicle. And then the y-axis tells you the carbon intensity per mile of travel. So about 450 grams per mile, about 300 billion VMT. If you take the area, that tells you the total amount of greenhouse gases associated with this particular block, which is about 138 million metric tons in California in 2010. 2050, we can see that the size of the bar is getting smaller because vehicles are getting more efficient, but also we have the introduction of a couple of other different blocks here. The purple is battery electric vehicles. The light blue at the end is fuel cell vehicles, and we have a little sliver of plug-in hybrids as well. And then by 2050, we've gotten rid of all of the ICEs, and the carbon intensity of all the different fuels, the plug-in hybrids, the battery electric vehicles, and the fuel cell vehicles is much lower, about 50 to as low as, I think, 5 or 10 grams per mile. So we've got very clean electricity, very clean hydrogen, and some liquid fuel, biofuels and so forth, bringing that carbon intensity down. So the total light-duty greenhouse gas emissions is about almost a factor of 10 lower, 16 million metric tons. Okay, and the total fuel demand in the light-duty sector is also quite low. With all of this electrification, we have quite efficient vehicles, 110 miles per gallon on-road fuel economy. We also have a slight shift towards cars versus trucks, and this is an assumption in the model, not a decision in the model. Okay. Looking at the carbon intensity of transportation fuels, overall they decline about 40% from 2010 to 2050. This comparison is not, you can't quite take this number and compare it directly to the low carbon fuel standard because of a couple of issues. The first is that we're looking at carbon intensity on a higher heating value basis. We could have calculated on a lower heating value basis, which would give you a better comparison with the LCFS, but we don't have that number right now. And the second thing is that we don't include the efficiency multipliers for hydrogen and electricity. So this is just a pure numerical average of all fuels that are used in the state. But looking at individual types of fuels, electricity is very decarbonized, 12 grams per megajoule. Hydrogen is also fairly decarbonized, 50 grams per megajoule. Biofuels are quite low at 9 grams per megajoule. And what we do see is because we have interstate aviation and international aviation and marine outside of the cap, the model tends to shift all of the use of petroleum as much as it can to outside the cap. So airplanes will continue to use kerosene and jet fuel that are made from petroleum, whereas all the biofuels are brought inside the cap and used, like biodiesel and renewable diesels and so forth. But this is this graph shows the trajectory of carbon intensity over time. And then again, if you look at inside the cap, transportation fuels, the carbon intensity is actually even lower because again, we're removing some of those petroleum fuels that were for interstate aviation and marine. Okay. Looking at the cost of mitigation, this shows the cumulative mitigation cost. This is cumulative dollars spent per unit of emissions reduction relative to our BAU, in this case the low VMT scenario, just so that we're comparing the scenarios with the same level of transportation demand. And what we find is that we see we have actually negative mitigation costs over this modeling period in certain sectors, heavy duty, light duty, and then we start to see some positive costs associated with mitigation from medium and duty aviation and rail and so forth. And so the idea really is just that, well, first of all, the area of these different segments is I guess the total cost of emissions reduction. And so overall, the transportation sector sees a positive cost associated with mitigating greenhouse gas emissions, but several of the sectors are actually lower cost than the BAU scenario. Okay, and again, the BAU scenario includes some efficiency already. So these are not costs relative to what we have today, but relative to a more efficient reference scenario. So that makes it a little bit confusing because you need to know what's in the BAU scenario as well to know the total amount of emissions reduction and so forth. Okay, I'm going to switch gears and talk about electricity now. This California Times model has a simplified representation of the electric sector. So it's not as detailed as many of these electricity models out there. We treat electricity demand in California as one demand, and so there's essentially no transmission and distribution captured. It's really just looking at the essentially generation, supply, and resources that are used. Imports are actually, the way we model it, imports are phased out after 2025, and so this really just captures what the types of resources that are going to be used to meet the demand of electricity in California. And then electricity demand is defined or determined exogenously in the model. That means that we don't tell it what the demand for electricity is, but depending on how many electric vehicles are chosen or whether the residential sector decides to go to heat pumps versus furnaces, that determines internally what the demand for electricity will be in the model. And so that the model has to balance that and decide all of these various questions. And so we have the normal suite of power plant technologies, wind, solar, tidal, geothermal, biomass, and the fossil resources. And then what's shown here on the bottom right is that we have 48 sub-annual time slices that can capture both seasonal variation in electricity demand as well as time of day variation. So each of these little segments here is sort of representative of a day for each 2-month period of the year. So this is an average day in January, February, an average day in March, April, and so forth. Okay. So it's important because wind and solar generate at different times of the day as well as different times of the year, and we really need to make sure that our supply of electricity is actually balancing our demand for electricity at the right times. Okay, looking at the big picture in terms of the results from the GHG step scenario again, what we find is that we actually have much higher demand for electricity in our greenhouse gas scenario than we do in our BAU scenario. And this is for the main reason being that we have much greater use of electricity as a way to mitigate carbon emissions. So because we can produce low carbon electricity, we can move away from things like natural gas in our homes, which you can make those appliances a little bit more efficient, but if you can go to electricity, you can really get a much bigger jump, a reduction in the amount of emissions per unit of service. So going to a heat pump that's run on renewable electricity is much better than using a natural gas furnace for heating your homes or heating our buildings. And so that switch to electrification, the same is true of transportation, right? So we have electric vehicles, again, we're moving away from petroleum and other liquid fuels to electricity, and that's also the reason for this increase in electricity demand. The BAU scenario has about 50% higher, the GHG scenario has about a 50% higher electricity demand than the BAU scenario, 600 terawatt hours versus about 400 terawatt hours in the BAU. And again, that's in comparison to about 300 terawatt hours today. Our GHG step scenario doesn't include the use of any nuclear power or carbon capture and sequestration. These were included in some of the scenarios, but not included in our base greenhouse gas scenario. And so without these two potentially low carbon resources for electricity demand, we have a lot of renewables. I think you can see right down here, 80% RPS renewables in 2050. And so the question is, is that feasible? We have a lot of natural gas in the system to balance that intermittency issue, as well as hydro. And then we also have a little bit of excess generation that has to occur as well, that is in case wasted because we don't have significant amounts of electricity storage in the system. So we do have a little bit of excess, but we do achieve supply-demand balance in our model. Carbon intensity goes quite low. Again, we're starting at a value of around 350 to 400 grams per kilowatt hour today. It goes down to below 30 grams per kilowatt hour in 2050. And you can see for the different scenarios, even the BAU has a significant reduction in carbon intensity for electricity as well. Yeah, that's all I'll say about that. And then looking at this issue of supply and demand balance. Wind and solar supply a lot of our electricity. That's the green and the red in this graph right here. And so what we see is that we need hydro and natural gas really to balance the supply and demand when the wind and the solar are not sufficient to meet the demand for electricity. To meet the demand for electricity in a given time slice. And like I said, we have some annual excess generation, but it's about 3 to 5% on average on an annual basis. So it's not a ton. Okay, looking at the demand for electricity, we have efficiency improvements in the various end-use sectors. So looking at the residential sector, even the BAU scenario, the blue line here, shows that we have a significant increase in the efficiency. And this is, again, the BAU scenario is an economic optimization model as well. It doesn't need to meet a carbon cap, but it's trying to minimize costs. And so, as new lower cost efficient technologies come into the market, the model will adopt those as well. So you see that even in the BAU, you have about a 2.5 times improvement in efficiency in the BAU scenario. And then the GHG step scenario achieves by 2050 almost it's between 3.5 and 4 times efficiency. So quite a significant increase in efficiency relative to the BAU and certainly relative to today's numbers. And this is driven in part due to like LED lighting, shifting away from incandescence, heat pumps and so forth, shifting away from natural gas furnaces. Those are the big ones. And then you have incremental efficiency improvements in a lot of other appliances as well. This maximum efficiency is just showing the maximum rate at which the most efficient technologies could be implemented, but the GHG step is, again, trying to minimize costs, so it's not necessarily investing earlier to meet these targets when it doesn't have to. It just needs to meet this 2050 target. Looking at the commercial sector, the picture is pretty much the same or very similar. BAU increases by over 2 times in terms of efficiency by 2050. GHG step is close to 3.5 times, again by 2050, and the maximum efficiency is a little bit higher for the interim period. So again, not only do you see this efficiency change, but a lot of this efficiency change is again driven by shifts towards an electric appliance relative to a natural gas or wood burning or propane appliance. Okay, so and so that's one of the reasons why, again, we have this increase in electricity demand in our GHG scenario. Okay, so now I want to turn the discussion a little bit to the issue of costs. So we're comparing costs of our GHG scenario relative to our BAU scenarios. And as Sonia mentioned, we did 2 different BAU scenarios, in part because we wanted to kind of bound the cost, but also to provide people with the option of it's helpful to understand, how these cost differences come about. And so, when you have lower VMT in the model actually invests in fewer cars. So if you reduce VMT by 20%, you can have, potentially fewer cars on the road, and certainly less fuel demand, right? And so, but the fewer cars actually leads to a significant reduction in the total system cost. And so if you include that, you tend to, I guess, overestimate the benefits associated with of this particular scenario. And so that's why, for example, when you compare the cost relative to BAU in this left graph, a lot of the costs for transportation are negative, and that's because, again, you're saving money mainly from reduced investments in vehicles and also a little bit in fuels. Also shown here is that the demand for electricity is increasing a lot. So we have increased costs for the electric sector, and that's this red sort of wedge at the bottom. We have, after about 2045, the cost for transportation turns positive, and that means it's more expensive to mitigate after 2045. So we see some positive costs in the transportation sector out to 2050. And then orange and blue are the residential and commercial sector. So those are a little bit higher. We're investing in more efficient but more expensive capital in terms of air conditioners, heaters, and heat pumps, and stoves, and everything along those lines. When we compare to the BAU low VMT scenario, again, most of the sectors stay the same except for the transportation sector, which is positive everywhere, but it's fairly low in the early years, and then again it increases as we start to try and meet the most stringent 2050 target. Okay, so that's So I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about some of the other scenario variations that we have as well. We looked, as I said, the base GHG scenario doesn't include nuclear or CCS. We found that the CCS technology, which is carbon capture and sequestration, so that's capturing carbon dioxide streams from either power plants, refineries, and injecting it underground so it doesn't go into the atmosphere, that actually can have the largest impact on the results in terms of changing the mix of technologies and choices in the model, and also having the biggest impact on the costs of mitigation. And that's because we see the use of CCS in a lot of different areas within the model. It's used in the electric sector to mitigate some of the costs associated, or the emissions associated with natural gas generation. So you have natural gas with CCS. One of the biggest uses of CCS in our model is capturing carbon dioxide in the production of biofuels. Okay, and so only about a third of the carbon in the biomass makes it into the biofuel, and the remaining 2/3 goes into the atmosphere. And so if you can capture that 2/3 and inject it underground, then you're actually providing essentially negative carbon biofuels. And so you're providing essentially a significant offset with which you can reduce emissions and also reduce the use of other more expensive mitigation options. And so that plays a big role in bringing down cost and changing the kind of the nature of where emissions reductions are actually occurring. Other scenarios that we looked at, again, adding nuclear power back into the mix, also adding a much greater, even though we have a high amount of renewables already, increasing the supply of renewables even further. And these all affect only the electric sector generally, and reduce the carbon intensity of electricity and increase the available quantity of electricity as well. Higher biomass supplies obviously increase the supply of biomass and therefore biofuels, and therefore enables greater reductions from the transportation sector. Specifically, we had that about 40% remainder of petroleum in the mix. We can offset that even further in trucks and ships and planes and so forth, and that can bring down emissions pretty significantly. And then finally, we looked at a couple of elastic demand scenarios where demand reduction was another viable option for reducing emissions. And in those cases, we see that the model does in fact use demand reduction. We have reductions in electricity use by about 10 to 14%, and fuel use by about 5%. And so these reductions mean that limited supply of renewable resources as well as biofuel resources can actually make up a greater fraction of total supply, and reduces the carbon intensity of those fuels, because when you push out petroleum, you reduce the average carbon intensity of the total fuel demand, and so forth. Same is true of the electric sector. Okay, so now to look at some mitigation costs now across all sectors. I'm not going to break it down by different sectors, but just to look at across all scenarios rather. The cost of emissions will depend on whether you're comparing to BAU versus low BAU, low VMT, as I showed in that previous graph. And then also for the elasticity scenarios, whether or not we include the costs or the loss of consumer utility as part of the calculus of cost, right? So if you are driving less, that could, or heating your house less in the winter, or cooling your house less in the summer, those are all demand reductions that can save energy and save emissions, but they also can lead to, welfare loss from the consumer perspective. And those, whether you add those costs in or not, can affect dramatically what the cost of mitigation actually ends up being. So anyway, this graph here just shows the red bars show the discounted cost of mitigation relative to the low VAU scenario, which is low VMT BAU scenario, which is always higher than comparing to the regular BAU scenario. And these are the base GHG step and GHG line. So the discounted cost for comparing to low BAU can be about $100 to $120 per ton of carbon cumulative over the entire modeling period. But if you compare it to the regular BAU scenario, it's very low. It's on the order of, I think, $5 or $10 per ton. So a dramatic difference depending on how you count things up, whether that VMT reduction is free or not. If you add nuclear and CCS back into the mix, you can see the costs are much lower because these are relatively low cost and a much bigger pool of low carbon resources that you can draw on. If you only have available wind and solar and biomass as your only low carbon options, they become stretched to the limit, and you start to need higher and higher cost biomass and higher cost wind resources to tap onto. Whereas if you have this big pool of of CCS reservoir or nuclear, you're much better off. So again, that's true of anything. If you have low cost, low carbon resources, you're going to be better off. And then we have a couple other scenarios that I'm not going to talk too much about. But again, these last two show the elasticity scenarios where if you only include the cost of investments and fuels, the cost can be quite negative. But then if you add back in the cost of demand reduction and the loss of consumer utility, then the costs are increased again. And so that's where these little white diamonds show up as the net cost of the cost of less services being provided is cheaper, but then less services mean lower utility, so that adds back cost and the costs are back up. But just in terms of providing appropriate sort of context for these costs, the mitigation costs, discounted mitigation costs are somewhere between $20 billion and $330 billion. Again, this is discounted back to present dollars at 4%. If you compare that, or if you calculate that on a per resident per year basis, those numbers translate to about $9 to less than $200 per person per year mitigation cost. And then if you look at that in relation to GSP, so gross state product, if you assume a growth at a little over 3% per year, it ends up being a fairly small fraction, about 0.03% to about 0.5% of GSP for these mitigation scenarios. Now, I will place a very large caveat on this to say that this does not include costs in the industrial and agricultural sectors. We didn't model those sectors specifically in terms of what technologies would be needed and used to meet the demands for energy in industrial and agriculture. So, but the costs that we did calculate are, again, on these orders. So one could argue relatively modest costs relative to certainly the GSP number. Okay. Is this where we're switching? Okay, so I'm going to turn the presentation back over to my colleague Sonia, who will finish, I think, the.
Thank you. So we're almost done. 2 more slides to go, then we'll open up for Q&A. I'm going to wrap up very quickly. One is to talk about other California Times model we're doing that are not part of the big model that we presented today, because these models are more complicated, more experimental, more exploratory. But I want to give you a flavor about the types of work we're working on that we'll be excited to share in the next year or so. The first model is the work by Calais Ramil and Professor David Bunch, trying to incorporate consumer choices into the model that take into account consumer choice and consumer behaviors and how they respond to policy, such as policy incentives, infrastructure build out, for example. Second model we're working on is to collaborate with Professor Mike Lehman from Civil Environmental Engineering and grad student Christina Zapata, use the output of our California Times model to calculate air quality benefits by 2050. Third model is hydrogen infrastructure model by Christiane and Dr. John Naughton that break out our one region California Times model into 9 regions and look at region-specific hydrogen infrastructure build-out and cost impacts at a more regional, spatially disaggregated level. The fourth model is the water use, looking at the integrated impacts between energy and water. It's by our grad students and myself, take the outputs of the California Times model, Energy Future to 2050, and look at the water impacts. Another model that I did mention is the work by our grad student, Saleh here, looking at doing a deep dive into the building sector and trying to analyze policies such as the net zero energy buildings and so on and so forth. So last slide, key conclusions. As we show, the carbon intensity of the electric sector need to be drastically decarbonized by more than 90% by 2050 in order to hit the climate target, greenhouse gas emission target by 2050. We need significant increase in renewables, almost 80% by 2050, and the range depending on whether CCS and renewables are available or not. Carbon intensity of transportation fuels decreased by 40% by 2050. As we caveat, this is based on high heating value, also calculated slightly differently compared to low carbon fuel standard. If you use low carbon fuel standards equations, you need to give a greater discount or discount to electricity and hydrogen, so the numbers are likely to be below 50. We can calculate that number pretty soon and give them to you. Road light duty vehicle fuel economy need to increase its vehicle efficiency to greater 110 mile per gallon equivalent in 2050. Low carbon biofuels are critical for non-LDV sectors because in transportation sector, due to the limitations in mitigation options on electrifying these non-LDV modes. We have greater increase in electricity use due to the need to almost greatly electrify all end-use sectors, residential, commercial, and transportation sector. Significant drastic, the last point is about the cost calculations. Our cost calculation can vary quite widely from negative 75 to 120 over the lifetime of the modeling period, and it depends on assumptions about availability of technology, particularly CCS and nuclear, assumptions about demand reduction, and also assumptions with technology costs and how which BAU scenario do you compare to. So that's it, and that wraps up our presentation, and we have quite a few questions coming online.
Yes, thank you. And I'll since we're on the web, we need to talk into the microphone. So please raise your hand. I'll bring it to you. And we also have a good, healthy number of questions from the internet, and I'll read them for you to respond to.
Sounds good.
So we'll sort of balance it between the questions here and on the internet. And if we don't get to answer all the questions from the internet, we will definitely send an email back with some response. So let's start with one from the internet. The question is from Dr. Simon Nui. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. And there are several questions, and we'll start with one. Does the low VMT scenario represent SB 375? What is your suggestion to value the co-benefits and costs of potential low VMT scenarios?
Yeah. Yes, the low VMT scenario is, I think, probably the best way to put it is it's consistent with SB 375. And in terms of costing and valuing, I think we haven't spent a lot of time sort of delving into that area, but it's sort of becoming clear that we should. And so in terms of, it brings up a lot of issues in terms of, cost of infrastructure, cost of changes in land development, and other things that I think sort of greatly complicate the sort of the economic analysis. But I think we are spending some time talking with other researchers at the Institute of Transportation Studies who do work on this in much more detail to try and address some of the costs associated with many of these management options.
And, like we presented in this version of the model, because we don't cost out the costs and benefits, which are very important, we kind of present two different types of BAU, and that's kind of how we deal with it in a very simplistic way.
Okay. Let's take a question from the audience here.
Yes, I had a quick question, whether there are plans to publish any of these conclusions?
The reports will be available online in a few days. There are about 150 pages for the main document, 200 more pages for the supplementary, and we'll hand over the database, so everything should be online. We're writing up the journal paper, so we don't have peer review publication yet, even though a lot of we talk with a lot of colleagues, so we get a lot of feedback. So reports will be available. We're working on peer review journal papers.
Yeah, this is Mike Waugh. On slide 14, I'm curious as to how that graph was populated. I don't know whether or not there was a particular target with regard to CI reduction, or somehow this was part of overall optimization. But we're always interested with the low carbon fuel standard, for example, in terms of availability of some of these alternative fuels. So I don't know how this was actually populated, what was driving this particular graph.
Yeah. So we have supply curves for biomass that come from work that has been done at UC Davis. So doing a detailed spatial agricultural model to try and understand where the mostly waste products would be available, so whether it's forestry waste or ag waste or municipal solid waste. So we have basically a supply curve that defines the cost and quantity, or quantity available at different costs for each different resource. And then we add in transportation costs and production costs and losses. So again, this is based on a certain assumption about what all those supply curves will look like by 2050. Again, it amounts to about 7.3 billion gallons of gasoline equivalent of what I would constitute as very low carbon biofuels. Is that? Is this in-state? No, it's a mixture of in-state resources. A little bit less than half is in-state resources, and then the other half is sort of from the western U.S. generally.
And so, if I understand your question correctly, basically, how this graph is generated is based on that, we need to achieve 80% reduction across all sectors. All the sectors are trying to do what's economically rational to meet the 8% target. And this is what the model decide based on our assumptions across the whole energy system, resource supply, cost of refineries, cost of transport and vehicle costs as well. So it's a life cycle cost, trying to minimize the life cycle cost. And this is kind of what the model say, this is the fair share from the transportation sector.
Okay, let's take a couple from the internet. Next one is from Mr. Philip Guillemet. I understand that CCS and nuclear power were not considered available in the GHG STEP scenario. Will CSS and nuclear power be available for the future scenarios?
Oh yeah, so I think maybe that question was written early, but yeah, we showed some results from very, very briefly, but from a couple of scenarios that include nuclear and CCS. So yes, they're in much more detail in the report. We don't have time to delve into every single scenario in this particular forum, but yeah, you'll be able to read much more about what happens when you add in those two technologies.
Okay, let's take one more. It's from David Daniels. It seems that a necessary condition for hitting the 80% reduction in GHG emissions by 2050 target in these scenarios is the wholesale replacement of gasoline internal combustion engines in light-duty vehicles. In light of this fleet turnover, what role does the LCFS play in achieving the 2050 target?
I'll start, and you can add to it.
If the response is too detailed, we could always send an email.
I guess in a nutshell, and there are a few questions kind of related to about the role of specific policies, cap and trade and others, ZEF programs. So in our model, we try to incorporate all the important scenarios, policies that we know all the way to 2020 or 2025. And it turns out a lot of those specific policies are non-binding. Means that in order to hit the 2050 target, we need to do everything we can. And oftentimes that will exceed the requirement by those existing policy. And in this version of model, we did not analyze LCFS endogenously. We make certain more simplified assumptions. But you can see from this graph, which is slide, I don't have the slide number, but it's a transportation carbon intensity slide where it shows that, again, if you adjust for how LCFS calculate, it basically shows that in order to achieve the 2050 goal, we need to go beyond the low carbon fuel standard.
Okay, one from the audience here.
Yeah, my question is, actually my question and thought and comment is related to some of the things that people talked already about. The whole analysis that you do, the whole modeling approach that you do, you're looking at a series of assumptions associated with that, a series of different technologies, and looking at potential for these assumptions, potential for these technologies. And based on that, you try to determine what the outcome is going to be. And your outcome is determined to be 30% reductions by 2050, and you're looking at what the cost associated with that is. Mm-hmm. Throughout your presentation, you talked about which parameters and which assumptions may be important, may not. But it might be a good idea to structure something which is going to be basically to look at the whole system and look at the parameters, look at the assumptions, and try to do some evaluation to determine which ones are more critical, which ones more important for the outcome that you're going to predict. And you can go one step beyond that. You can assign probabilities associated with each one of those and try to figure out exactly what the outcome of that is going to be. That becomes more complex, but at least provide some information to everybody and say, well, these are the most critical policies and most critical assumptions that we need to pay attention to. And I think that is going to be extremely useful if you're going to do that.
Sure.
And that applies to the VMT question, that applies to some of the other questions that people asked about.
Sure. So that's a very good comment. I would probably say that in this phase, we try to do various sensitivity analysis, and I think from the sensitivity analysis, it's very obvious that there are certain assumptions about technology availability, and their costs are very important. CCS, nuclear, demand, external demand reductions are yes, those are, and availability of biomass are extremely important in determining the outcome, in terms of technology penetration and adoptions, as well as the cost of mitigations. In terms of thinking about doing Monte Carlo simulation, that's definitely a good suggestion. We didn't do that primarily because the model is so complex at this current stage. If we didn't understand it fully, we just go ahead and do Monte Carlo simulation, we might lost. we will be the first one get lost. So that might be the second step that we will try to do, but we feel like the first step is really trying to understand the modeling behaviors based on very specific assumptions. But
Oh, definitely.
sure.
Okay.
So-
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, yeah, so the follow-up comment was that, yeah, even the assumptions about the cost and availability of CCS are assumptions that are uncertain and will affect the inputs. Yes, I wanted to follow up the first part of your earlier comment, which is, yes, all of these parameters that we have in the model are assumptions. Some are better justified than others, but they're all uncertain, especially out to 2050 in terms of what the cost of a battery electric vehicle will be, what the supply of biomass will be. There's a lot of things that play a big role in the outcome, and I think, yes, we can do a better job of highlighting which ones play an important role in this particular solution. And certainly I don't know if we stated it, but the assumptions that we have are clearly will turn out to be not correct, right? You can't predict every last assumption and say that this scenario that we presented is the future of California. But I will just say that, yeah, we're hoping that by varying assumptions and looking at different scenarios, we can at least understand how the system might change under differences, but we're never going to get these things perfect.
Okay, let's do another one from the internet. From Claire Broom. Why use the GHG step as your default model? The objective for GHG reduction is to mitigate climate change. Putting off change to 2050 is pretty counterproductive.
That's a good point. We model GHG step as our primary case because that's the policy. Well, it's representative of the current policy in California, which is that we have a 2020 goal and we have an aspirational 2050 target, and we don't have interim goals at this particular time. We would like to know, I presume at some point we will have an interim target, but the goal of this modeling was actually to understand what is the best way to achieve the 2050 target and not necessarily what is the best way to mitigate cumulative emissions. Yeah, but basically, I think that the model is useful to answer those questions. What is a good way to minimize cumulative emissions? What is a good way? What is a decent interim target to balance maybe reducing cost and reducing emissions? So there's plenty of potential for the model to do all of these things. This was the GHG step is partly the base case GHG scenario, just because it most accurately reflects the situation today.
And I'll add, which I think is an important point, is that we didn't say it explicitly, but one of the goal of this times model is to figure out what should be the interim goal for 2030. I know this is a huge question for this day, and it's kind of the key question we were trying to explore in our CCPM, which I presented. That and in the end, our model shows that our model have certain behaviors that like to, as I showed at the very beginning, that actually the most economically rational pathway is to delay action a bit later based on its economic theory. We didn't feel very comfortable putting out as that this is the best solution from our model. As I caveat earlier, that's based on our assumptions about discount rate, also because the model caveats of not be able to properly model technology forcing. And so I think looking at this model, looking at its caveats, and also looking at other models that that use more different approaches to figure out the interim goal is kind of one of our unstated purpose of this modeling exercise.
Okay, from
What is the source of your economic and demographic projections over time, and does the composition of the economy or the population change?
So basically, the primary source is the Department of Finance projections. So our population goes, I think, to about 50 million people in 2050. We don't have significant, or we didn't really spend a lot of time looking at the actual composition of those 50 million people. We just have projections of VMT from various sources like the MFAC model, or projections of, housing stock and residential demand from various sources that look at what the square footage of those structures might be. So it's basically sort of extensions of current energy service demands scaled to the population and housing stock that we've seen projected in various state resources.
So we have very detailed documentation in our report about how we estimate future service demand and they kind of do different, it's done differently for transportation sector and residential commercial. So they don't take into account composition population, but like Chris said, that we try to look at the stock changes for the different buildings and assumptions about building efficiency. But again, we realize there's a lot more work can be done in the future, especially California have a lot of targeted policy toward residential, toward the building sector. So that's kind of future work we'll look into in greater detail.
Okay, one from the internet. So I think you may have addressed this, but this is from Paul Smith. Could you clarify whether the chart on the left page 14 includes all transportation fuel or just LDV? The graphic on page 13 covers all modes but only shows input to LDV.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Oops. Okay, yeah, so slide 14 is all transportation fuels. So the graphic on 13 was just meant to be representative of how the model structure flows, but I didn't want to show it for every single transportation mode. But this is all transportation fuel supplied in California, including interstate aviation, marine, which are not included in the cap. I'll say that probably the 10th time I said that, but yes.
Since that was easy, let's do another one. Does the model account for changes in fuel costs and prices? How do fuel expenditures change due to climate policies? And this is from Simon Mui again.
I guess the best answer is we didn't calculate explicitly what the cost in fuel expenditures would be, but my suspicion is that they are lower given the very high efficiency that we see in a certain, at least for light duty, the 110 miles per gallon equivalent. Really, the cost shifts to capital as opposed to operating costs, but that said, maybe the overall cost of transportation is, I would say, comparable. That if you remember the graph on the mitigation cost, yeah. So some sectors are actually lower cost relative to the BAU. So light duty and heavy duty being two of the biggest ones that reduce emissions and are slightly lower cost relative to the BAU.
And then, so if I understood the question correctly, that we don't we don't make assumptions about what the future fuel cost will be to some extent. So we basically take the supply curves, high, low oil prices, make from EIA and natural gas price projections, high and low, and various scenarios. So that's the only exogenous assumptions we have. All the fuels, future cost of fuel, how much to supply gasoline, diesel, how much to supply biofuels are all endogenously calculated from the model. And ultimately, when you translate to dollar per mile, that takes into account all the model calculated costs of producing fuels and the cost of purchasing vehicles, so they are life cycle cost. And one of the reasons that BAU low VMT scenario result in a lot of cost savings, as Chris said earlier, is you reduce investment in vehicle technologies, but more importantly, you actually also reduce investment in supplying those fuels upstream. That also result in large cost savings.
Hi, this is great work, and it's quite comprehensive too. Yeah, thank you guys. I have a few questions. So one question is about the major conclusion. It seems that by 2050, light-duty vehicles on-road fuel economy should be reaching about 110 miles per gallon gasoline equivalent. How do you guys think that is realistic, since the current fuel cell vehicles is about 70 miles per gasoline gallon equivalent, I think so. Yeah. And even conventional gasoline is even lower, it's about 30 miles per gallon. That's one question.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it's certainly we don't have, from a technology perspective, there's a technology answer to the question, and there's also sort of a consumer adoption answer to the question, right? And so from a consumer adoption perspective, I think it's quite hard to say whether or not we would turn the fleet over to be 100% non-gasoline by 2050. But from a technology perspective, I think it's at least feasible to say that, and the idea of this model was just to say, given what technologies are available and what we foresee to be available, what would a low cost or reasonably low cost, low carbon future look like for California? So I think that the technologies are on the move such that we should be able to achieve. I think that is realistic from a technology perspective. Like if we see the fuel cells being adopted, in the 2020, 2025 timeframe, those 50 mile per gallon fuel cell vehicles should be 80 mile per gallon, fuel cell vehicles in the time frame that we need them to be. And so a lot of that 110 is really the battery electric vehicles that are doing their weight to kind of shift that overall average upward, and then the plug-in hybrids and the fuel cell vehicles will be kind of below 100 miles per gallon, but getting close, I think.
Okay, another question is about efficiency improvement in end-use sectors. It seems to me for the residential sector, like by 2020, the efficiency change relative to 2010 is about two times of 2010 level. What is the reason for the major efficiency change? Is that because 2010 efficiency too low, or the other things?
Okay, that's another very good question. So because this is an economic model, part of the reasoning for the lack of efficiency improvements right now is sort of this idea of an efficiency gap. So while compact fluorescent bulbs, for example, are much more efficient and actually would save people money, they're adopted, but not in the quantities that you would expect them to be if people were purely economically rational, right? So you would not see presumably you would not see very many incandescent bulbs if people were making decisions purely on economics. And so the idea is that the model, even in the BAU, but also in the GHG step scenario, it's seeing these sort of essentially gaps in efficiency. And even with some of the tweaks that we do to try and delay the introduction of of some of these advanced technologies, it's still saying, okay, I see this as a way to reduce cost, and this is a way from, to supply the energy that in the lowest cost system, because it's not just the appliance itself, but it's upstream too, right? Every kilowatt hour that you save from using less electricity also saves power plant, capital to build power plants and so forth. So the model is taking all of these things into account and trying to minimize the cost. So yeah, you could argue that some of these things are maybe, given the fact that we haven't seen these efficiency improvements already, they may not occur as quickly as what we're seeing in the model.
Okay, another one from the internet, from Dr. Mui again. Does the transportation sector overall hit 1990 levels by 2020 from the direct measures? Does this point to the importance of having transportation under the cap?
I have to say that we have not looked specifically at the 2020 transportation number to see whether it fits into back to 1990 level. We could probably eyeball this chart and see if it. Well, we don't have a 1990 number on here. Okay, so
We'll take a look.
we'll take a look at that and we'll try to get back to you. Yeah.
Okay. Another one, I noticed that HEVs completely disappear from the solution between 2010 and 2030. Why wouldn't HEVs be part of the solution in 2030? This is from
Okay.
Mr. Guillemette.
So I'll have to recall. I think the answer is sort of a little bit of a quirk of the model, but the model in the 2030 timeframe, the model invests a lot in flex fuel vehicles, and so the model of the technologies we have, we don't have a flex fuel HEV. So I think that's one of the biggest reasons is that this blue block includes gasoline ICEs as well as flex fuel ICEs, and so the model is investing quite significantly in the flex fuel ICEs in this intermediate time frame. So that's, I think, the reason for that.
So there's a large, actually non-marginal biofuel use between 2020 and 2030 that kind of determine the penetration of the adoption of flex fuel vehicles, which we don't show here.
Any questions here?
For the electricity sector, I think I heard you say that you had excluded agriculture industry, and I also assume water pumping and streetlights, that sort of thing. Are those carried in some kind of just base band that you don't muck around with, or is the amount of power that they do use now and will use in the future just excluded from what you're working on?
Okay, so I think you're mistaken in the sense that we don't model the technologies used for, like, say, water pumping in the agricultural sector, but we do just provide a scenario of how much electricity or natural gas or petroleum is used in those sectors, so the industrial sector as well as the agricultural sector.
Well,
So-
I'm just thinking about water pumping,
Yes,
moving it up and
yes,
down
the
the
water
state.
pumping electricity demand is included in the agricultural sector and it is included in the amount of electricity needed to be generated for California.
So that's kind of exactly what you were asking. Whether we include them or not, yes, we include them. Whether we model any possible mitigation options to improve the efficiency, for example, no, we don't. So.
Okay, another one from the internet, from Claire Broom again. I'm surprised your mitigation costs were less with nuclear and carbon sequestration. Did you include, for example, out-of-state wind, which has low levelized cost of energy and large supply?
Yes, we have wind resources that we took from the READY study. So it's a study for the CPUC that looked at how California would meet its RPS targets, and so they looked at, and so we included wind resources from basically almost the entire western U.S. and parts of Canada as well. And we have included transmission costs. So that's the one area where we do have some spatial detail in the model, where we do look at least the cost of transmitting that wind back to California.
So maybe I'll just add another point that because our model is sort of non-spatial, all the projected capacity that needs to build out, they don't necessarily need to all build out within California. They just say how much will be needed to meet the demand level in California. So they can be built in California or elsewhere, other states. So that's kind of, I want to point it out.
And all electricity emissions, even those out of state, are included in the cap.
One from the audience here.
Hi, Jeremy Herby with the ARB. I've got several questions. I'd be willing to break them apart, to let other people ask. But one of the things that I found in some of my work is that the VMT fuel economy and the biofuel assumptions are extremely sensitive in a lot of the things we look at when we start looking out to 2050. So just real quickly, the 24% VMT, that's just extrapolated SB 375 out to 2050?
It actually is not extrapolated 375. We looked at the travel demand literature and tried to sort of estimate we tried to we looked at the travel demand literature and looked at kind of the potential for reductions from a number of different management options, and kind of put that on the BAU scenario to reduce from that level. And then I think we looked maybe once or twice, but just to see how it compared, and we thought it was consistent with the levels looked at for 375, but it's not specifically calculated from 375.
And another is the biofuel. The cap you've got is the 7.3 billion gallons. To supply that, you're assuming a lot of that is being supplied from, or you said half is coming from in-state. Is that going to require any biorefineries being built within state?
Yes, we've modeled the investment and operation of biorefineries in the state, yes.
To say a bit about the refining technologies.
Yeah, so I think a lot of we sort of just lump them all into biofuels, but we have a lot of primarily, I think, Fischer-Tropsch production of biofuels, so drop-in replacements for gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel especially. So those three are the kind of the primary products of these Fischer-Tropsch technologies. And again, when you use that technology, you have the large potential for sequestration if that technology is available, in which case you can make quite a significant dent if that technology is available.
And then I want to point out a large part of those biofuels are used in non-LDV sector.
Yeah.
Because this is kind of the point where we're saying over the long term, there are many economical solutions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from LDV sector, electricity and hydrogen. But other non-LDV sectors have very little options to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. To a large extent, they still need to rely on liquid fuel. So basically, most of the biofuels go into those non-LDV modes by 2050.
Okay, let's do one more from the internet and one more from the audience. This one is from Jimmy Nelson of Union of Concerned Scientists. It says, we've found using the switch model that bio-CCS for electricity combined with electrification can be really advantageous in terms of cost and emissions. Did you model the ability to do CCS on biomass for electricity?
Yes. So we do have biomass CCS plants. We found that they were not chosen because there are more options to reduce emissions in the electric sector than there are in things like, as Sonia mentioned, heavy-duty trucks and so where the biofuels are more important. So because every unit of biomass that you take, when we have a constrained supply of biomass, whenever you take 1 unit of biomass to go to electricity, which could be displacing something like natural gas or even wind or solar or something else, you don't get as much of an emissions reduction as you do as displacing a gallon of gasoline. So our model, because we integrated over the entire economy, found that the best use was for transportation. And so we didn't see any biomass used for anything besides transportation.
Yeah, this is Bill Dean with Kelly PA. In your cost, I suppose you could look at the cost year by year. Does it ramp up approximately linearly?
Not quite. It actually ramps up, like you can see here, the costs sort of spike after 2045, and that's consistent with the emissions reduction, because in our GHG step scenario, we have emissions sort of dropping off after that time frame. So, but we haven't looked specifically at how they compare, but I think they're correlated in the sense that as you see a lot of emissions reductions in that later time period, you see a lot of the costs coming in during that time period as well.
Yeah, I think it'd be interesting to compare the growth rate, which you said is 3.3% per year, to the percent of the cost in that particular year to see how much it delays the growth.
Okay, thanks.
I guess with that, we'll wrap it up. Thank you very much for coming. It was a great presentation.